Hello, Yakri here with another Artifact video. This time I want to talk about randomness and the role it has to play in game design, and in Artifact in particular. Now, I want to preface this video with a disclaimer that I'm not talking about if randomness is a good thing, but rather how, why, and when it has value in games. Now, randomness is fairly well established as an important aspect of game design across nearly all genres, but that said, although it's well established that randomness has a place in games, my views on how, why, where, and what kinds are good are very much my personal, semi-educated opinion, rather than objective fact or anything. The content in this video applies pretty generally to almost all games, but I want to focus on Artifact and card games in particular. Both because Artifact is the game that I'm most anticipating at the moment, and because card games have a much bigger inherent problem with RNG than other games. Now, you might be thinking that I'm referring to the fact that card games involve randomly shuffled decks, but that's more of a strength than it is a problem and can be played around. No, the issue with card games is that they are far too predictable, aside from the fact that they have a random deck order. Once you know the cards each player started with, and maybe the first few turns of draw, you can probably figure out a perfect play order that will inevitably lead to one player winning based on their initial draw and deck order. This isn't actually what you do in practice, but it's an important point to illustrate how predictable they are. And this isn't a big deal for inexperienced players because they don't have the knowledge to predict an opponent's likely plays or likely first hands, and because they make plenty of order of execution errors and lose some advantage there. However, there aren't actually that many opportunities for these kind of mistakes in card games. Players take relatively few actions and get a lot of time to think over what to do, and really good players can come very close to playing the perfect game that you might be able to predict from their initial hand. This is important because we want the best player to win most of the time, and that requires those players to be able to get some advantage over their opponents over time by playing better than them. In this context, being good at a game is a matter of making fewer mistakes over time than your opponent when given the opportunity, which really makes it important to give players many opportunities to make mistakes so that there's room for that gap between differently skilled players to make itself apparent. Alright, so where does randomness come in? Well, randomness disrupts pre-planned actions and forces the players to make choices often more quickly and creatively than they would otherwise be required to. This is something that has really piqued my interest in Artifact because Artifact has a very good, in my opinion, semi-random mechanic of adding minions to random lanes each turn, but it's a reliable number of minions if I remember correctly. This kind of slow, steady RNG will even itself out in most games, and as they say, slow and steady wins the race. Just metaphorical races, though, not normally real ones, unless we're talking about marathons and, still that whole thing where you speed up at the end, Anyway. In this case, the metaphorical race is presenting the players with unpredictable problems that they have to solve in order to give the better player the opportunity to slowly build consistent advantage. This is very heavily contrasted with the kind of ridiculous, heavy-handed single-action RNG that Hearthstone is famous for, such as Yogg-Saron's ability to pretty much win you the game in one play, no matter how far behind you are, as long as you're lucky enough. Essentially, you want the value provided by RNG to never eclipse the value players get from making active choices, and in fact, you want it to enhance that by giving players more non-obvious choices and by disrupting the board state going forward so it's more challenging for players to think ahead. This is very important for games in general and for card games in particular because very random games can be very frustrating to play for more competitive players. Additionally, they make for bad tournament format games, even if it's possible for good players to slowly stand out over many games. And this is because heavy randomness deciding one or two games in a series can easily swing the whole tournament away from the player who perhaps should have won. On the other hand, games with insufficient random elements also have problems. These games can be very stale and seem decided from turn one. Upsets and unfavorable matchups are less likely, and the power of the deck relative to the role of player skill is much higher. And the predictability makes the games less interesting to watch. Of course, there's at least a little more to randomness in this context than just allowing player skill to be better expressed. The existence of randomness in games creates variety, and in the context of card games, of course, the concept of having a deck itself is a useful form of randomness for this purpose. The odds of getting a given specific starting hand are pretty low, meaning that even in a vacuum without any further randomness, although you might have a very static, specific game plan for a given opening hand, the number of possible hands are very high. So, from a spectator's standpoint, specific games aren't going to repeat themselves all too often. Now, when you combine that with well-executed randomness in a match, you get a situation where random events during the match affect how you play a given hand and a given deck order. And they would affect a different hand and deck order in a different way. This creates a huge amount of variety in each match off of just a little bit of RNG. This is, among many other things, one of the reasons I think Hearthstone is so successful as a spectator game. Although its wildly excessive randomness is unpopular amongst competitive-minded gamers, it creates a huge amount of variety in terms of what exactly happens in a given match you might be playing or watching. So, to sum up, randomness in games is a tool that can be used to give players more opportunities to demonstrate their skill and to create variety in individual playthroughs of a game, which means matches or series for card games. Like with many design aspects, it can either add or detract from the general quality of a game and how much fun it is to play. From what I've seen so far from Artifact, I have high hopes that it will hit that sweet spot in between too random and too predictable. As far as this applies to other games, nailing that randomness sweet spot is something I often look for when evaluating a game, especially in certain genres. And, well, that's all I have to say on the topic. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like it, be sure to like and subscribe to my channel. And let me know in the comments down below what kind of RNG you either enjoy or absolutely can't tolerate in games of any kind. Thanks for watching. Yakri out.